Hello, and welcome to the Brave New Weed podcast. And now, here's your host, Joe Dolce.
Welcome to the Brave New Weed podcast. These are high-minded conversations for the post-prohibition generation. I'm your host, Joe Dolce, and joining me is Matthew Hendershot. Matthew.
Greetings, Joe. How you doing?
I am very well, thank you. You know, we got a lot of feedback on our last episode, which I want to share with our listeners. But before we do, I want to tell you what we're going to do this episode, okay? You know, there's not that many people who can get universities to teach students about cannabis. And I've always wondered, why not? Because last year, this industry created 300,000 jobs. And it's probably the only new boom industry in the country today. Our guest this week is one of the few educators in this industry, and his story is pretty fascinating about how he got to do this. So stay tuned. We're going to talk about colleges and cannabis and how they can help each other. So like I said, we've got a lot of feedback on our last episode, and one was a note that came from a fellow named Sam, and he scolded me, basically. He said, "Hi, I'm the executive director of the Arizona Dispensaries Association. I'm a fan of your podcast and intrigued by your review of the cannabis available in this state, and I'd be happy to point you in the direction of some quality flower. You know, I personally love the stuff that True Med has. He has a couple of grams of Jack Herer left. And there are many other quality growers in the state that you can pick up anytime." So he also says, "Matthew, I don't have jurisdiction in Germany, but would welcome review of a forest bath on the next episode," which really made me laugh. You know, I thought maybe it would be a good thing to talk to Sam, Matt, and see what he had to say. So I called him up, and he agreed to a quick interview. Here it is.
Joe and I will continue to publish every episode of the Brave New Weed podcast for free for you, our listeners. But we could always use your support. If you've got a little extra change rattling around in your pocket, you can cruise over to patreon.com/bravenewweed and become a supporter of the show. Everything that you'd pledge to support helps us to increase the guests that we can have on the show, even eventually the frequency of the show. And we have a great set of rewards out there, including copies of Joe's book, invites to special events that we will do in New York City, all sorts of fun things. So if you're enjoying the podcast and you would like to support us, visit patreon.com/bravenewweed today.
Well, Joe, I really appreciate the invitation to come on and set the record straight. I know you had the invitation to scold you, but as I mentioned over our correspondence, I am the proud father to a 4-year-old, so I get plenty of scolding nowadays with us all being cooped up in our little house. So all I want to do is invite you to try the quality cannabis that we have all across the state here. Got to find you some stuff that isn't dry and sandy.
Where am I going to find that stuff, Sam?
So there's a handful of places that I'm very proud of, and really we have quality stuff all across the state. True Med is an absolutely wonderful dispensary in the Phoenix area, and I have about a quarter left of some Jack Herer that is absolutely wonderful from them. But if you ever make it up to Flagstaff, Greenhouse of Flagstaff has a wonderful strain called Honey Banana. And Copper State Farms, which is one of the state's largest producers, has a new line that they're calling DNA, and I'd highly recommend any of their strains, but most specifically, Holy Grail is a great strain from the DNA line from Copper State.
Where is most of the cannabis in Arizona grown? Because it is hot here, man. Is it grown outdoor or indoor?
Yeah, it is very hot, especially now. We're inching up towards those consistent 100-degree days, and a lot of the canopy space here in Arizona is under greenhouse. There is a significant amount that is indoor, and in some of the northern parts of the state, outdoor grows are possible. But for the most part, you're looking at either indoors with tightly controlled environments or greenhouses.
Sam, is there any indigenous species to the state? I mean, Native Americans used cannabis all the time. It's part of the secret history of cannabis, I think. But there are certainly enough Native Americans here. Are there any indigenous species?
That is such an amazing question that gives me some homework. I think that I will be reaching out to some folks here to try and get that answer, because as you may know, we actually have 22 federally recognized tribes here in the state, including the Tohono O'odham near you here in Tucson. So I would venture to say the answer is yes. I just don't have a specific answer on some native strains to the region. Well,
then I'll scold you in that case. Consider yourself scolded.
Well, next time we speak, I'll have that answer. Absolutely. Yeah.
Fantastic. And is there anything about Arizona cannabis that distinguishes it from, say, New Mexico or Nevada cannabis, which is sold next door in the next neighboring states?
Yeah, that's a really good question, and I would maybe focus less on some of the quality or the aspects there, and just talk about maybe the environment that we have in Arizona. We have quite a string of the libertarian mindset, the wild, wild west, and I think that you see that in a lot of really fun and exciting expressions, and that it's relatively easy to enter the market as a cultivator. So we have some great kind of smaller boutique grows that are really experimenting with some high quality strains that might not be palatable for some of those larger scale operations to explore just from a cost and margin perspective. And I think because of that relatively low barrier to entry as a cultivator, we're going to really see some exciting new things coming onto the market. And as you probably know, Joe, as you've discussed here on the podcast, Arizona is one of the last best hopes for legalization efforts here in the states for this ballot cycle. Because of the COVID epidemic, signature gathering is almost non-existent. But we were in a great position here in Arizona where we had enough signatures to qualify before the shutdown went into effect. We're still gathering. We haven't yet formally finalized the petition gathering process, but we're very positive that the question to legalize adult use will be on the November ballot here in Arizona.
Well, I hope so. What would the chances be for passage, Sam?
I think that the polling here in Arizona is consistent with national polling. I think that you're looking in the mid to high 60s as far as those who approve. And I think just one kind of statistical fun fact. I know that some of your listeners are pretty wonky, but the effort in 2016 failed just by a slim margin, about 2.5 percentage points. And if actuarial tables are to be believed, about 4% of the people who voted no in 2016 are now likely deceased. So just on that alone, I think that our chances are pretty good. But I think that the market has matured, and I think the energy nationally and locally is ready and ripe for adult use legalization.
That's great. Let those dead people usher in the state of legal cannabis in Arizona. Sam, that's Richard, right. Thank you very much for scolding me. I really appreciate it.
Oh, happy to be on. It's an honor. Thanks so much, Joe.
Joe, I'm really actually happy that you took the time to talk to Sam after he reached out to us. And thank you, Sam, and all the listeners who take the time to reach out to us. I hope that we didn't offend anyone too much with, I think, what was a very tongue-in-cheek assessment of the sort of downtown brown that we were getting in Arizona at our various times. But that's very good, and we love hearing feedback from everyone. And there's another bit of feedback that we got from Natalie McBrayer, who's another listener who wrote in and said, "Hi, Joe. You don't know me, but I just wanted to thank you for continuing great work on the Brave New Weed podcast. Because of your podcast, I have made phenomenal connections with other healthcare professionals in the medical cannabis world. Here in Seattle, like Dr. Agarwal, your podcast inspired me to move beyond being an advocate and to pursue formal training in cannabis. Now, as a cannabis nurse educator and certified medical cannabis consultant, I'm speaking at national conferences like the Cannabis Nurses Network Conference 2020. Thanks for doing what you do." Thanks, Natalie. That I don't know how you could get a better endorsement for our podcast than something like that.
Really? Could you imagine that we're actually changing people's lives by doing this? How fantastic,
And
right?
she went off and started a whole new carear. That's amazing. Congratulations.
It's amazing. And I'm not really going to take responsibility for that, but go, Natalie, go. I thought that was great. We got one more bit of feedback from a woman that says, you may be interested in some of my inadvertent science experiments, quote unquote. A couple of years ago, I started adding big handfuls of fan leaves to my smoothies, and in less than a week, my hair stopped shedding. And this happens every season. I also drive them out when I have too many. It doesn't work quite well as the fresh, but it helps. And after sitting around in a jar for months, it decarbs itself, and I actually get a buzz from fan leaves. And I also make an oil infusion from roots and incorporate that into pain cream, and it works. How about that?
It's fantastic. I mean, we know that these chemicals exist all throughout the plants, obviously in different concentrations. So might as well, waste not, then want not.
I just love that we're getting people telling us about their recipes. So
keep them coming.
Listen, that leads me to one more thought I'm having, which is, there's a couple of celebrities I'd really like to have on the podcast, and I have no idea how to reach them. For me, I'd like to talk to Michael Phelps. So I just want to say, any listeners have a contact to Michael Phelps or his agent, please send it to us. I'd really like to know how his being a cannabis user changed his life for better or for worse. I'm presuming for better. Who might you want to talk to?
Oh, Lord. To be honest, the first thing that jumps to my mind when you bring that up would be to try and speak with Elon Musk. I mean,
that's a really good idea. Yeah.
We saw last year how just the perception of him consuming cannabis just put his life into turmoil. And I would love to hear from him, his reactions to that, his how do you fight back against that when people are pointing at you and saying, evil man smoked a joint. What do you do?
I wonder if Elon cares. That would be interesting to know. So anyway, Elon, if you're listening, give us a call. We're happy to talk to you any single time. As I mentioned at the top of the show, this episode is about higher education. And Rob Mejia is the president of Our Community Harvest, which is a cannabis education company and a New Jersey minority-owned business. He's also the author of the Essential Cannabis Book, a field guide for the curious, and the Essential Cannabis Journal, personal notes from the field. Both of these books provide researched info about cannabis with an authentic, engaging narrative and real-world examples that demystify the plant, explain the science, and examine the stigma and social racial justice issues surrounding cannabis. He's an alumni of Georgetown University and an adjunct professor at Stockton University, where he teaches the preparation for cannabis internship class. It's part of a suite of courses leading to a Stockton University cannabis certification. Now, this is an interesting episode because we have an interview with Rob, but following it, we also recorded some presentations from the senior class that a few of his students made to him and to me. They asked me to come on and give a critique, which I was more than honored and happy to do. So as you'll see in the blog we sent out with this episode, there is a link if you want to watch any of these student presentations, which are pretty interesting. I highly recommend it. They're going into places that not many people are going. And before we do that, though, I want to present Rob Mejia.
Hi, I'm Rob Mejia, president of Our Community Harvest. I'm also an adjunct professor at Stockton University in the Cannabis Education Department, and I am a cooking with cannabis enthusiast.
Rob, I'm so happy you were able to join us on this podcast. We have some very interesting things to talk about. But before we get to exactly what I want to talk to, I want to explain how you became Professor Pot. And tell me how you started teaching this at colleges and what the response was. How did the idea even occur to you?
Well, like many things in cannabis, it certainly was not an easy journey or a simple journey or one that had a straight line. To back up just a little bit, I'm actually one of 13 kids, And growing up, cannabis really was not part of my life. I had tried it a couple times in high school and college, really not too much of a big deal. But then my sister Teresa, she got uterine cancer. And when she got uterine cancer, unfortunately, she went from being healthy, mid-50s, exercising, good diet, the whole thing, and she was put on a myriad of opioids. And at that point, she had been pharma-free up to that point, and then she started to lose her appetite, got confused, and my brothers and I kept wondering, why is nobody offering her medical cannabis? Definitely for her pain, and also we know it stimulates appetite. And that question really started to nag at me. Unfortunately, she passed quickly, so we never had the chance to find out what it could have done for her. But I thought, well, I still have 11 siblings. I'm still here. My parents are still here. And I don't want to be in that position again where I don't know whether medical cannabis could help someone. And so I started really jumping into the industry with 2 feet. I went to every seminar I could. I called doctors, nurses, researchers, anybody I could talk to. Went to every seminar online, just really dove into it. And the result of that was that I wrote a book called The Essential Cannabis Book, a field guide for the curious, which is geared towards it's a really Cannabis 101 book. And it's for people who just want to know everything from the history to consumption to medical possibilities. I really tried to cover it all in a pretty slim book and also include stories from people in the community. Mm-hmm. So that's really how I started our community Harvest, which is a cannabis education community anchored by the book that I did and publications thereafter.
Now, there aren't many people who are teaching cannabis or cannabis studies or the industry in state universities and state colleges. How did that begin? Because that's a big leap from doing our community Harvest.
It is. And what happened is I have a son who was looking at colleges, and Stockton University, where I now teach, is one of the schools on his list. What was interesting is I had read that they were starting a minor in cannabis studies. And so I thought, well, we're visiting the campus and he's sitting in a class. Rather than me just sitting by myself, why don't I try to talk to one of the professors there who was already in the department? And so I made an appointment to talk to him. And my son and I visited campus. He went off to visit a class, and I sat and I talked to the professor at Stockton University who was teaching the Introduction to Medical Cannabis course. And we hit it off so well that we talked for 2 hours nonstop. My son had to find me, kind of drag me away. And I had established a wonderful relationship with Professor Tom at Stockton, to the point where he asked me if I would come in and guest lecture to his class. And so I did. And then I was invited several semesters thereafter. And I also attended their cannabis employment seminar that they had on campus. And really, I just kept kind of showing up on campus. At one point, I think people assumed I probably was a professor there. And then it turned out that my company, Our Community Harvest, created an online continuing ed course for Stockton called Introduction to the Cannabis Industry, which really focused on jobs. And from there, they'd made a job offer to me to teach their preparation for a cannabis internship course, which I gladly accepted. And I'm just completing my first semester there in just a couple days.
We should tell listeners that Stockton Community College is in New Jersey, which is also where you live. How many state colleges or community colleges actually teach cannabis studies? Do you know?
I do. And actually, it's Stockton University. So we are a 4-year research-based university. And
Forgive me.
Totally fine. And we offer a minor in cannabis studies. To your question about how many programs there are, they're really cropping up in the last semester. But offhand, there's roughly 15 to 20. And most of them are science-based or growing-based. So places like Northern Michigan, for example, they have a science program. So you have to have a lot of chemistry and bio. And actually, Colorado State University Pueblo is starting a major next year, and theirs is primarily focused on growing and, again, on science. The one thing I absolutely love about what Stockton University is doing with their minor is you can have any major. So I have people who have a communications major, journalism, science, marketing, you name it. But then the nice part is you can take a suite of 5 courses in cannabis, and that sort of helps you round out your major so that you become prepared to enter the industry and focus on your major course of study.
Okay, let me ask the obvious question that just has to be done because it plays into every cliche. Do kids come to your classes stoned? I mean, do they expect you to be lighting joints or giving them a vapor hit during class?
They do not. Certainly as far as I know. We're actually we're a serious class, but we do have a lot of fun. I will say that. But no one vapes in class. No one lights up before or after. I certainly haven't seen anybody who looks definitely impaired. And I certainly absolutely do not show up that way either. I mean, we talk about cannabis being a profession and that they have a lot to offer there. And so we are serious about what we're doing. But again, we do have a lot of fun as well.
No doubt. I just had to ask the cliche question. You have to do it at a certain point. So how would you describe the students who are taking this seminar? Like, how would they fit into, I don't know, how do you describe them compared to the rest of the student body? Do you have any context for this?
The interesting part is they're not really very different from any of the other students.
I'm not surprised.
It's just that they see that this is a market that is growing. In New Jersey, we're just at the beginning of our cannabis program. We only have a medical cannabis at the moment, although we're voting on adult use in November. And right now, there are only 18 total licenses that have been granted, and there's only 9 total dispensaries, and a lot of things are being built. So the timing for these students is perfect because hundreds of jobs are going to be offered, well, right now and for the next year, 18 months. And then when adult use passes, which it fully is expected to, I saw a poll that said New Jersey residents are probably going to vote at about 61% in favor. And when adult use happens, obviously we'll have many more licenses that will come through, and the industry will really be expected to boom. Plus, with what's happening with the economy and COVID-19, we need income, we need jobs, and I think things are going to move rapidly here.
So this is the time for a confession to make to the listeners, which is that Rob and I are actually developing some coursework to bring to universities, colleges, and community colleges in cannabis studies. Obviously, we both have education platforms, and we're both committed to education. But it seemed to both of us that colleges are really going to be suffering in the next year or 2 or 3. Can you talk a little bit about that, Rob, and how difficult it's going to be for them and how cannabis actually might save some of higher, I hate to say it, but some of higher education?
Yes, what's interesting is once COVID-19 hit and campuses were closed down, every college professor had to now teach online. And for many of us, it was pretty eye-opening. Because what you're used to doing in person, you now had to translate that into meaningful learning activity for students. You had to keep their attention. You had to make things compelling. You had to be able to take information you had that you possibly could have transferred in person effectively and to do it in a way online that made it meaningful for them. And so when that happened, I really started thinking, well, this may last longer than we expect. And even if it doesn't, the need for online education for colleges is so important for a couple reasons. One is colleges right now are not sure about what their enrollments are going to be. You can imagine students now deciding, should I be going to college in the fall? Is it going to be an online experience? Is that what I want? And universities are facing huge budget deficits because state funding is down, enrollment is threatened. A lot of schools have had to refund money to their students because they haven't stayed in the dorms. They haven't used their food allowance. And so they're in a tough shape. And online courses are effective, both cost effective because you can reach quite a number of people. You don't have to limit the seats. It's education that can be available on the go at any time, self-paced, and you can build assessment into it. And so it actually, it solves a lot of problems that colleges are going to have. And I think it will raise some money for them. And I think it's a smart thing to do.
Well, I think the fact that it's online education in cannabis is particularly interesting. Again, this sounds like a totally self-serving promotion here, but let's face it, cannabis is a booming industry, even with COVID, and it's one of the few booming industries in America today, isn't it?
It absolutely is. Just a couple months ago, I was reading a report that we roughly have about 240,000 full-time cannabis jobs across the country. And then when you add in support jobs, and support jobs are things like website design, photography, dispensary design, HVAC, fitting, things like that.
Lawyers,
Lawyers, real estate. That gets us up to about 300,000. And depending on what state you're in, those numbers are growing between 15 and up to 40%. If you look at Illinois is booming right now because of their adult use. So the jobs are out there, and they are professional jobs. It's not just the wellness coordinator or the bud tender, as people will say. There are professional jobs, long-lasting jobs, and they cover so many different areas.
I would imagine if I was a student today, the idea of pursuing a liberal arts education, as much as I would like to, would probably take a back burner to something a little more practical. Are colleges grappling with this, do you think, or are they not ready to grapple with this?
They're definitely grappling with it. I mean, you can even see a trend as of a few years ago that internships became such a standard offering. And I don't know about you, but when I went to school, I don't think I know anybody who did an internship, or maybe one or two people. But now pretty much every student has an internship. And part of that is to help them get used to the world of work, but then also to get them inroads into some place that they might want a career.
So what kind of internships are typical for students of cannabis, for example? It's not working in a dispensary, is it?
Well, first of all, there's a couple things. You have to be 21 and over for a lot of the internships. And so that's why my course in particular is limited to juniors and seniors. But the internships can be remote. So sometimes there are things like marketing projects. And the project could be something as simple as somebody who is relaunching their brand, for example, and they need to contact the 200 dispensaries who already use their product to find out about the new brand, new pricing, new products, etc. And so they may do an email campaign. They may do some website updates. So there's those kind of projects. It kind of depends on what skills the student has. I do have a student who's quite conversant in working in a lab. And so her internship was actually working with a company and testing CBD potency on a number of products.
Wow. Okay. Good. So they're really out there in the field. They're really out there in the market getting real hands-on experience. And
they are.
Please go on.
One other interesting example I was going to throw out there is there's a company that is actually launching some cannabis artwork. And so a student created the website for them and then put their designs up on a print-on-demand website. So now you can get their T-shirts and posters and all kinds of interesting things. But people don't really think about cannabis branding and trademarks and merchandise. And yet here we have a student who's working on a project in that area.
Well, the whole idea of cannabis internship is quite new, and it's also good for the industry. It's also new for the industry because up until now, they were basically hiring, people who came along. What's your job experience? Well, I smoke 10 times a day for 30 years. That doesn't really fly anymore. I mean, the industry is more evolved than that. It's definitely more advanced, and I know that they're looking for people with real skills, right?
Absolutely. Anytime you can have real skills and enhance that with cannabis education, you are a very good candidate for the industry.
So in terms of, you said, online education is going to be the new normal, but does it suck? I can't imagine sitting through an hour class just staring at a screen. It feels so. Listen, I work on a screen all day long, right? I coach on a screen, and it can feel somewhat interactive, but there's a lot of pausing. There's a lot of hesitation. There's a certain staticness to it. Have you been able to sort of conquer through that, or
a little? What's interesting is I do find that the level of courses offered have been all over the map. That some students have said, this has been just awful. I'm not getting the kind of education that I thought I would get. And other people have said, this works well for me. I like the flexibility of it. And I think the big thing is that as an instructor, you have to put the time in to make sure that you're using some of the assets that are available online. So for example, I had a little bit of difficulty trying to show a video, but last week I was able to show the video and we talked through, and it was actually a PSA that the country of Australia had tried to reduce underage cannabis use, and it was a campaign called Stoner Sloth. And if you've not seen that, it actually is an unintentionally funny PSA that just hits a lot of wrong notes. So we watched that video, and then we talked about what they were trying to achieve and where they missed. But that was one form of activity. And then also you can build polls into the class, so you can ask questions and have students respond. You can set up a chat, and the chat can be a group chat, individual chat. You can share your screen, so you can put things there. So I do try to make it as interactive as possible. And I also try to give assignments where the students have to have some sort of short response. So they each have to have they get the stage for, 30 seconds at a time, for example, and that keeps them engaged as well. So it's really up to the instructor to make sure that they are tapping into all the assets that they can in the online area. I mean, one thing that I did that is to set up a podcast with my students. And that is something that I had not heard another instructor do. And they loved that. They thought that was just fantastic. And then I also had another instructor who came in, and he had done some photography of the cannabis plant on an electron microscope. So his images were just phenomenal. But I had him come into the class, and he talked and shared the screen for about 15 minutes, but he showed some images that were just phenomenal. I bet few people in the world have ever seen them.
Oh, I'd love to see them myself. Yeah, we did. I'll tell the listeners, we did a Zoom class where a bunch of students did their final presentations, and I got to critique them and ask them questions. And we are going to try to show it on the podcast at some point once we edit it and put it together. And it was really great fun, and I was really impressed with the range of topics that they approached. But let's go to the other side, Rob, because we're about to bring this idea of online cannabis education for degrees into colleges. And I'm suspecting the response is going to, I want the response to be, hell yes, we've been waiting for you. Where have you been? It's not the response I'm expecting. I'm expecting a little more hesitancy and concern. What are you expecting?
I think probably somewhere in the middle. I will definitely acknowledge that there still are schools who see cannabis as stigma and as something that they don't want to get involved in, that they don't want their, quote, brand involved with. So I do think we probably will get some of those responses where people will just not want to enter the conversation. But then on the other hand, they do see that cannabis is medicine, and cannabis is health and wellness, and cannabis is job opportunities, and their students are asking about it. People are using the product. It's a big part of the economy, and it will be a growing part of the economy. So I think the forces that say we need to look at this are pushing every bit as hard as those forces that are saying, oh, I don't think we want to get involved.
Yeah, it's interesting to think about. When you have institutions like Temple University offering cannabis studies, when you have Johns Hopkins doing research on MDMA and PTS, right? When you have Cornell offering, I believe Cornell is offering courses in agriculture and growing. I mean, those are not exactly, second or third tier rate institutions. Those are pretty first rate institutions doing some pretty advanced work. So I'm interested to find out how you think we can sort of say that to these folks without incurring their wrath. Any ideas?
Well, I think part of it is just gathering some of the data on the schools that are offering the programs. One other impressive school that I'll throw into the mix is the University of Connecticut. At the University of Connecticut, they actually have a hemp greenhouse, and they have a course in the basics of cannabis cultivation that is so popular that they teach it in a lecture hall, and it books 400 students.
Wow.
And those 400 students are only seniors and juniors. By the time it gets to sophomores, it's oversubscribed. You can't get in. And they're teaching the online course in cannabis cultivation this summer, and they're looking at offering another section as well. So there are definitely good schools that are looking at it from a lot of different perspectives. But that's one that just was eye-opening when I saw those numbers.
That's interesting. So if you were to teach a course on growing, would you say to the students, go into your backyard and plant these seeds today? And we're going to do we're going to do some very, hands-on experimentation with different growing techniques, different organic fertilizers, different lighting, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera.
That would actually be one of the limitations of the course. If you were on campus, you could actually go to the greenhouse, and you could require a part of the course to be actually getting your hands dirty in the dirt and working with the individual plants. But being at somebody's home, first of all, I don't think you'd want to encourage your students to grow for any number of reasons. But
depends on where you live. I mean, if you're in California, you can do 6 plants.
That's totally true. But the one thing I was thinking of is I actually am very good friends with a hemp grower out in Oregon who runs Tweedle Farms, and they do a bunch of high CBD strains. And what I was thinking about, because I actually was thinking about putting together a class on cultivation, that I thought, wouldn't it be interesting to work with him and to actually start with how he chooses the seeds, look at how he starts to propagate them. Let's look at all the different stages, the vegetation. Let's talk about nutrients. And I would put the students in teams and basically give them their choice of a strain with a goal of, what do you want to produce? Are you going to do CBD? Are you going to try another cannabinoid, like maybe do something with CBG? You'd have to put in input on what nutrients they would use, what lights, et cetera. But I would make it kind of a distance learning project, and we check in periodically with the grower on camera.
I think it's a great idea. As a matter of fact, I think you could do controlled experiments. Like, we're going to try this fertilizer versus that. We're going to try this lighting situation versus that. You can take them all the way through growing, harvesting, curing, and then
Absolutely.
And then finally to testing. Like, okay, what did we end up with? How close did we get to what we initially envisioned here? It's an interesting course. It would probably span 6 months, 6 to 8 months.
Yeah, you'd have to check back in a little bit later. Although you'd probably want to start with something that would grow quickly, so that would be part of the equation. So students would want to come up with something that auto-flowered, for example.
Yeah. I also think the idea of experimenting with high CBD strains is very now. It's so cool and it's so interesting, and nobody knows about these things. And we should be educating people about how to grow high potency CBD strains, don't you think?
I do. But again, I think that sort of points out a couple things. The challenges in the online class. So before, when I could walk to a greenhouse, now I can't do that. How do I replace that experience? How do I even make that experience possibly better? How do I innovate in that area? So those are all the kinds of things that some instructors probably hate to look at, because it is a lot more work. And, you're going to try some things that are probably going to fail. They'll try some things that will work very well. But I guess I'm curious enough and tenacious enough that I like those sort of quandaries.
I think we're going to work on it together, because one of the here's why I want to work on it. One of the attractions to universities is, how do you attract students? And then how do you retain them? My feeling is, if you give students a long-term project that has a real thing at the end, a real note of completion, it's very satisfying, right? And a course like that actually would have a real final note of completion. You would actually see how you did.
And you're so right about retention. That is another one of the big issues with colleges, because just because you can get a student to come to your campus doesn't mean they're necessarily going to stay. You want to give them the resources so that they're successful, they're comfortable, they're taken care of in any ways possible. And you also want to give them a meaningful experience so they'll want to come back and they'll succeed.
I think we could give them the greenhouse. I think you could do social distancing in a greenhouse. I just think you have to limit the time. You have to be more rigid about it, right? This number of students are allowed in at this. I hear some muffling in the background. Are you moving?
Oh, I'm sorry. It was a small cough.
Okay. Let me start again. I think you can do a greenhouse experience with students. You would just have to be more rigid about timing, limiting the number of people in it. More scheduling would be involved, basically.
There definitely would be more scheduling. Plus, part of the issue might be there are some schools where they might flat out just not open up their campus for a semester. And so in that case, you couldn't even get to the greenhouse. But it depends on on what their approach is, because I also have heard other schools that are going to try to do something similar that you said, only allow a certain number of people, a certain amount of time, certainly more disinfecting and cleaning protocols. So all that has to be accounted for.
Certainly. Now, I know you've only been doing the course at Stockton for a year so far, but what are students most interested in? Are they interested in economics? Are they interested in medical? Are they interested in just how the whole thing works in the brain? Tell me.
I think one thing that surprised me a little bit is that students have really liked a little segment in the class that I do called This Week in Cannabis. And part of the reason I did this is because I wanted to sort of train them to become experts in keeping up with the cannabis industry. And so I wanted them to look at some blogs, to read the right publications, to listen to the right podcasts like yours, and to become knowledgeable about what's going on out there. So we have a little segment that covers domestic policy or domestic issues. Then we go to international, which is always a lot of fun. I actually think they've really enjoyed learning about what's going on in other parts of the world, because it's fascinating the way that other countries are approaching policy, whether it is Australia or, just fascinating what Brazil did recently, for example, allowing CBD, but having to import the raw materials. There's just all these little subtleties, I think, in the international market that keep them pretty intrigued. And then we look at New Jersey. And then I also talk about what sort of leads I have for them, because part of what I do as the preparation for internship class is try to help them get internships and jobs. And so my leads are their leads, is what I tell them. And anyway, we have a lot of fun during that segment because they'll bring up stories as well. But I think just knowing about cannabis and knowing more than their peers is something that they really enjoy.
I think it's also great to train people how to read the news, and especially read it for opportunity and to be thinking about where the future may be. I want to recommend to you, we did 2 interviews with a gentleman called Jim Plamondon, who operates the Thai Cannabis Corporation. And what they're trying to do in Thailand is incredibly interesting, about building a sustainable network of small farmers who can actually support themselves on cannabis as opposed to growing rice, which is would be an enormous economic leap forward for these small farmers. Okay. So maybe clue your students into that before the semester ends. Okay. I thought they were great episodes, and Jim is incredibly erudite and very provocative, and will definitely lead to good conversations with your students.
Excellent. I will definitely recommend that to them.
So, Rob, I want to thank you for joining us on the Brave New Weed podcast. I want to wish us both luck in pursuing our dream of providing, let's say, higher education to state colleges, universities, and community colleges. And I want to ask you before you go, you're a user. What was the last surprising, big, or great thought that occurred to you while enhanced?
I have so many of those ideas that it's kind of dangerous sometimes. I do find that when I think I'm having some sort of breakthroughs or being especially innovative, that I write those things down. I do like to journal, and that I check them out the next morning. And what's interesting is some of them are still amazing and good ideas to pursue. And there's some of them that were just, fun at the time, and you move on from there. But I think actually the biggest breakthrough I had was exactly what we talked about, that colleges need my services. They need our services. And so I'd like to go out there and help them out.
Well, if that was the result of having a puff or two, then more power to you, sir. Let's see what we can do. Thank you so much for your time, Rob. I really, really, really appreciate it.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for the opportunity.
Listeners, I want to personally thank you all. The Brave New Weed podcast is now bigger and more popular and more widely consumed than ever before. And that's because of all of you. But we don't want to stall out now, and we want to continue to grow. So we have one simple ask. If you love the show, share it with one other person who you may know, who may benefit, or has a curiosity and just wants to learn more. Your act of sharing with just one person can help us continue to grow, and by that growth, continue to bring you all of the best news, commentary, interviews, features, and more right here on the Brave New Weed podcast. any of our listeners out there who enjoyed this conversation with Rob and do want to check out those presentations, those student presentations, and have a little bit deeper and more focused dive into various areas of the world of cannabis, we encourage you to do so. The link is available in the show notes and in the blog that accompanies this podcast. And Joe, I think it's great that we have people like Rob that are out there again, working on our side to normalize and legitimize. Like you said at the top of the episode, cannabis is a booming business and has the potential to get even bigger. So being well-trained and well-informed about the business aspects, the legal aspects, all that stuff, not a bad course of action for somebody trying to figure out what they're going to do through their college years and the rest of their career.
Well, as you know, as you heard in the podcast, he and I are collaborating to produce some of these educational materials. So we really want to do it. And, really we share this mission. He's like the nice side of me, Rob. He's such a good guy. He's so well-natured. And we both share the same mission. But before we leave, Matthew, I want to ask you, have you been doing any forest bathing?
I did. It was kind of a humorous moment at the end of the last episode where I threw that out there. But I did go out that day. Spring is fully in action here in Germany, and Leipzig in general has a huge, huge affinity for green space. So I was able to actually use my Firefly vaporizer. I took it with me. I had a nice dose of cannabis and walked through a wild park that is just south of town. And yeah, letting yourself open up to the sights and the sounds and the smells and the space, I actually found it to be super de-stressing and relaxing.
I took your lead and I did some research on forest bathing myself, and I came across a book by a gentleman called Amos Clifford, and he's written sort of the book, you know it. And I wrote him a note and I said, we'd love to have you on the podcast. We'd like to talk about the connection, if there is one that you've noticed, which I'm sure you have, between cannabis and forest bathing. So haven't heard back from him yet, but I'd really love to have. I think it's the right time to do it. And again, so speaking of celebrities I want to have on the show, if any of you know Amos Clifford, please send this his way. Please let him know that we're interested in talking to him about the paying attention to the tiny things in the forest.
Yeah. I would say to people too, with this experience, don't overthink it. Taking a nice 2-hour walk is probably enough to chill you out and relax you anyway. There's no wrong way, I'm going to guess, to actually go Waldbaden. So just find yourself a little place of peace and have a nice walk,
Waldbaden in German.
Waldbaden.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for doing that. Let's see what comes back our way. Good to talk to you.
Always a pleasure.
Thanks for listening to the Brave New Weed podcast. This episode and all future episodes are made possible by amazing listeners like yourself. If you like what you've heard, we encourage you to show your support by giving $1 a month for special access and rewards on patreon.com/bravenewweed. You can also follow us on Twitter and Instagram via @bravenewweed. Find us on Facebook at facebook.com/bravenewweed. And remember, you can always find more information about us or information discussed in each episode by pointing your favorite browser to bravenewweed.com.